Angle for 2023, I believe in a very topical and relevant theme around national healing. And it is my pleasure to welcome our panelists and speakers, Prof. Gobodo, Pumla, and Anita Bosch. And if I can just share briefly their CVs. Prof. Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, I first became aware of her work as an early PhD student at UCT. And her ideas on intergenerational trauma, memory, and healing really revolutionized my understanding of what transformation processes take. Her work explores the ways in which the impact of dehumanizing experiences of oppression and violence continues to play out in next generations. And she opens up consideration for the historical continuities of trauma. I also like her focus on African-based knowledge systems and approaches to healing, introducing new concepts based on the Xhosa cultural tradition. And I welcome you to explore more of her work. She is a renowned academic, is a fellow at many institutions, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
And then we have Anita Bosch, chair of the Women at Work here at the Business School. And I became aware of Anita as an early academic here at the Business School. And what touched me about Anita's focus is her determination to break the gap between the private and interpersonal and the public and professional, and the ways in which these worlds collide, and the importance of seeing the interlinkages between the two. And I think this is a really important lens and perspective when we talk about trauma, which is both extremely personal, but also collective and shared. So welcome, ladies. I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, and Jerry, for that introduction. Perhaps if I can start by saying, where did this theme come from? How did we decide on this theme? And it was last year already. Recognizing what's happening in our country, recognizing that load shedding doesn't just come from nowhere when it was a country with an incredible system to support us, incredible infrastructure, knowing that what's happening is not what we're observing on the surface and what is trailing in the newspapers, that there must be more to it. And understanding that there is a sense of trauma in the system has been, and Prof. Pumla will talk about that, but also continues, sort of is newly energized through what's happening with the state. It's perhaps lack of provision, the way in which it's interacting with citizens at the moment, and also just failing state. And those are the headlines, but knowing there must be something else. So Prof. Pumla, which brings me to you and your area of research. And I've watched your speeches, I've listened to what you're talking about, and I'm triggered by, it seems as though it would be obvious what you're studying. But I want to understand what made you actually become a scholar, thinking about intergenerational trauma, the ideas also of forgiveness. How did that happen for you?
The many starting points, and as you know, sometimes one thinks of a moment, but actually there's a convergence of several factors, experiences from my young days, from my childhood days, as a child under apartheid, an adult, and a professional during apartheid. So there's a convergence of several moments in my life. But in terms of my work and my interest in this research, the starting point really that frames it was my work with human rights lawyers who were defending anti-apartheid activists who were facing they were tried for being prisoners, and many of them were facing the possibility of being hanged because the death penalty was still enforced in those years. And I was invited by human rights lawyers to work with them during the so-called necklace murders. And my exposure to the young people who had committed necklace murders and their families and their communities raised some very important questions for me at the time. I grew up like them, you know, in a township, and in obviously, you know, in a different decade than they did. And so the question for me was, what is it that's, and the question that I had to answer for the courts is, how do we understand the necklace murders? You know, that people who are neighbors, sometimes who are friends, would commit such brutal acts. And my interest went beyond these questions to try to understand what it is, not just what it is in terms of the social movements and the anti-apartheid movements, but really went deeper into who are these people? What did they become? Who do they become when they commit these atrocities? Now, I was trained as a psychologist, and so I drew from my work as a psychologist and trained in the psychodynamic tradition, which is to say the psychoanalytic, you know, work that understands behavior as a convergence of the internal personal and the external social. And so the trope that I used then to understand what was going on was informed by the notion of, in psychology, the reenactment of trauma, which is to say people repeat their pain, their traumatic experiences because they have not been properly dealt with. And so that was what drew me to this work. It was really that experience of encountering the most brutal murders, you know, the ritual of violence, the ritualizing of these repetitions of violence, repeating in their case, because the community that I was doing research on, or rather that I was working with, was one of the poorest in the country, in the Eastern Cape. It was a township in the Eastern Cape in Queenstown. And the conditions of life were the most base and the most dehumanizing that one can imagine. And so it was, in a way, a sense of an uprising of a life that was worthless, throwing it out there, projecting it out there, and in an attempt to deal with the complexity of what this evokes, the sense of being considered worthless, the utter dehumanization of their lives. And so these repetitions, this is what I was interested in, and this is what drew me to the study of trauma. The work of forgiveness in the midst of my work, because I worked with the human rights lawyers, and then when I completed the task, I was interested in delving deeper, in studying this as a doctoral inquiry. And so in the midst of all of that, I was invited to join the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then I was face to face with the possibility of repair, which is language that I use even at that moment, that there is a possibility that, you know, you can never throw out that possibility that people can transform. And the TRC is contested, of course, as we know, but there was very clearly a demonstration that it is possible for people to change.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And, you know, that there's so many, as a South African, so many points of commonality, even though I didn't grow up in a township, know about townships, see it, drive through it, and so forth. and understanding then what it means for an individual that has been dehumanized by a system, by individuals, but also by the system, and then reenacting that. So I want to draw this a little bit back to our current situation then. We're sitting with really South Africa economically being under very, severe threat in many ways. A system that was economically, one could say in Africa, one of the strongest economies. Infrastructure was good. Many things were good, but yet there was seemingly a turn of events. There was a period at the beginning, the dawn of democracy, where it seemed as though it was sort of euphoric in many ways. The Rainbow Nation, the nation that trumped it all. Your analysis of that, your sense making of that, and then the turn of events, and whether it was really a turn of events or whether it was just waiting to happen.
Yeah, very, very great way of putting it, that whether it was really a turn of events. There is no question that it was a turn of events. But I return again to this idea of repetition, of the past. And to do that, I want to tell two stories. One from here, one from, the second one from the United States. 2 days ago, there's a report that has just emerged from the US, the murder of a young man, Tyler Nichols, in Maryland, Baltimore, by 5 Black policemen. Now, we know from the story of George Floyd and other stories, other murders before George Floyd, that it's always been white police in the forefront in the US. This time, it's 5 Black policemen. In fact, there's more, and they're all Black. And this is something that sometimes we are struck. There's a sense in which we say, oh, but how can it be? But when you think about the fact that our countries, the US and ours as well, these histories of violence, they go back several generations. It isn't a moment such as, for example, the Holocaust, which was a moment, a catastrophic event, and Jewish people left Europe, millions of them left, to escape the hate. In our countries, these violence, the colonialism, slavery, apartheid, the oppression went on for several decades. We are born, the birth of our own democracy, we were born, the new South Africa was born out of violence. In fact, historians tell us that that period in the 1990s was the worst, ever in South Africa. So we emerge, we are born from violence, and our transgenerationally, our history is that of violence against people who were oppressed. Now, this story that I just shared, there are many parallels in South Africa, and I'm not going to talk about the obvious, which is the Marikana incident, for example, but I'm going to talk about a story that came from an Eastern Cape school where a young Black teacher in a school drops a telephone in a pit toilet. And instead of giving up because he's dropping a pit toilet, what are you going to do? He calls a young boy who does not have, a father, a mother, is brought up by a grandmother, comes from a very poor home, gets this boy to strip and brings other boys to hold him with a rope and drops him in the toilet pit and asks him to search for his phone in the toilet system. Now, what is that about? And we know, had this been a white teacher and a Black boy, the private jet of the EFF would have descended on that town, and there would have been several buses from KZN and the Eastern Cape, with people to protest, calling for the blood of this person. But it was like a plonk. It was, 2 days in the Daily Dispatch, we saw nothing of that article. So the question is, what is going on? Now, in these stories, and in Marikana, and in, the Tatana in Bloemfontein, the young man who was, the teacher who was killed in broad daylight by the police. Again, it's this repetition of the imposition of power. It's the face of the oppressor is not white in these cases, but what is transferred from the past is the dynamic, is the power dynamic. It's the power and the power against the weakest. This young boy who comes from a poor family. It's a repetition of this power. This is why sexism and racism go hand in glove, because it's a cultural pattern that repeats itself, and it is about the projection of power on another who is weak. It's the defacing of the face of the other person, seeing them as less of a human being. So this is what is repeated here in all these stories that we are witnessing in our country where we are. It's really, again, it's a dehumanization of the marginalized, with a government that we were under the illusion that they will hold the highest moral standards. We expected that the government that supposedly freed us will hold the highest moral standards. They will not be brutal. And we are surprised. We say they've sunk so low, but actually they never rose at all. We say, oh, they've sunk so low, the ANC has sunk so low. But they never, we were under the illusion that they will rise up, but we were mistaken. Now, to the point that you made, at the start of your question, whether there was a turn or not. There was a turn, but there were certain things that we missed, I think. We missed the fact that these histories, you can't just brush it off by, a performance of testimony in the way that you did, and holding on to the, to the process of reconciliation as if that is enough. What we missed was that the pain and the trauma goes very deep, that there was much more that you needed to do. There is no question, of course, it was a euphoric moment, but it doesn't mean that it was not real. It was a moment of hope. It was a moment of real hope and a moment of real possibility. We imagined a different future for our country, and that was real, and that was possible. We could have embraced that future and journeyed with it in the way that it was imagined, with some taking responsibility for certain aspects of the journey towards a new future. We did not do that. It was almost like we're sitting back. We were satisfied that Nelson Mandela is going to take us to the mountain, and we trusted him, and still trust him, still trust that he was leading us in the right way. There is no, my generation trusted what he did. He was leading us in the right way. But the complexity of who these people are who are supposed to lead us, and the fact that they really had no vision except to be in power, not to lead, but to be in power, and in such a destructive way. I mean, when you think about it, it's so easy that for us not to see corruption as violence. It's easy for us not to see it as violence. And so it repeats as corruption. We talk about it as corruption, and yet actually it's a profound violation, a brutal violation of people's lives. It is violence personified, in the form that we know violence to be as a murderous violence. This is it. In fact, as you know, it has become murderous. The whole, culture of corruption has become a culture of violence. At our universities, within the political sphere, it's this sense of cruelty, the repetition of cruelty against people who have no power, who have no means. This is what is being repeated here, and there is no let out. I mean, our institutions are destroyed by this culture that has seeped straight into our institutions of higher learning. And so this is where our society is now, the brokenness, the rupture as a consequence.
And just thinking about that as the constituency that we're speaking to tonight, business leaders, leaders of organizations, considering what do we do with this? How can we lead so that we can create a space for both acknowledgement and inclusion, for generative thinking to happen, but being inclusionary about that? What is it that we as business leaders can do to try and break these cycles? There are some lobby groups that work on anti-corruption. Certainly at the business school also, a lot is taught about that. But how do we, perhaps first the question as business leaders, how should we conceive of our role as a leader?
I have no doubt that there are sectors within the business community of people who are really leading in the way that you are describing the anti-corruption watch. Business people who are constantly challenging the states, to bring about change. The TRC, I really, in part because I served on the TRC, in part because I believe that it was a moment of hope. There's a biblical text in the Old Testament that says, "Behold, I do a new thing." There was something about the TRC, about to be beholden, that this is something new. This is about a radical, process that is revolutionizing the process of transformation. It was that moment. And because of its focus on, transformation, creating a culture of social justice and redress, the focus on redress, restoring human dignity, the dignity of people who were dehumanized in the past. That's both a language and a model that I think structures in business, in the corporates, can emulate. That here was not necessarily, I'm not suggesting that gets repeats the work of the Truth Commission, but there's something in the language, in the languaging of that whole process that empowers South Africans in positions of leadership to draw from it, to think about what does it take to begin the process of redress. And then, of course, to ask the question, what's missing in that process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how do we then bring into the discussion, into the debate on the table, what was missing in that process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I really think that, there's something important about what we did as South Africans, to turn, at that point of turning. There's something critical, and the world agreed with us that this was a very important moment. But there was so much other stuff that was undoing, undoing that, that trajectory that was established at the time. There was a lot of undoing. There was a lot of denial of the past. There was a very eagerness to move forward and forget the past. You can't do that. Some people say memory is a destroyer. That's, yes, it may be true, but memory also is a builder because, it restores the sense of hope because you look back at what you were and you want to take a new step, to start anew. You don't start anew without actually understanding clearly where you have been. And so, and of course, because these are traumas we're talking about, acknowledgement is such a critical part of it. It's so central in this process. And so for establishments, for business establishment, what is the responsibility? The responsibility is, people talk about plowing back, you're giving back, you're plowing back. I had a conversation with a very dear friend. I grew up with her. She was a nurse and became a professor at KZN and was involved in provincial government. She was sending me something that really, it shook me to the core in terms of joy and just thinking about what people can do. She's showing me up in the near Milnerton. She's starting a garden using her own resources, and she showed me photographs of this garden in an impoverished area. She's giving back. She's working with the community, and not for selling. It's her in what she has made over the years. She is planting seeds and working with the community to have, to eat from the soil. Such a simple thing. So how can that translate into big business? All these resources that are huge resources. There are companies that are supporting education ventures, for example. I know I'm going to mention the Oppenheimer, Memorial Trust because they awarded me a gift for my work. But they are involved at universities, they are involved with NGOs, they are, and I mention them because they just are very close to my heart at the moment. But there are several other businesses. It is about how do you plan this example of my friends, who was a nurse who's retired now. But she has a sprawling garden, and green and spinach and everything, carrots and what have you. It's this small community of people in an informal settlement that she's working with. So it's that kind of thing, but of course, at a much larger scale for businesses to work with institutions, foundations, for example, within the corporate sector, they identify universities and they fund students to work with them. But that is not enough. We need a much more rigorous way of sustaining this because, again, you identify individuals, you help them go through a university. How do you sustain that so that, in the olden days, there was, when we went abroad for, research or study abroad, you had to make a commitment. You're going to go back to your country, to plow back. Yes. We need those kinds of approaches to these helping strategies so that there is sustainability, there is the possibility of growth. And it's not just about university, it's also about skills training. People nowadays are crying out for employment. People are feeling so dehumanized that you wake up and you are facing this yawning void of emptiness. What is your life? Whether you sleep or wake up makes no difference. In fact, precisely because it makes no difference, whether you kill someone for a cell phone or not makes no difference because your life, there's a sense of worthlessness. of yours as well as of the next person's life. And I think these communities, institutionally, whether it is in the corporate sector or at universities, have a responsibility to build those checks and balances, because people will regress to these levels of depravity, of barbarism. They will regress to this level. This is a psychological fact. We abroad, we come out of a psychological system where, as children, there's certain things you don't have a sense of control, and we grow up side by side the capacity to regress. And so the barbarism that you see in, for instance, these racist acts that you see both institutionally and socially, or hatred within our workspaces, or the deep, destructive corruption that we witness in government today. There's a need for checks and for the community to provide those checks and balances, so that you don't slip into that regression, into that mode of regression. Your community and the culture that you establish restores that sense of stability, so that even if there's a possibility of slippage, the community holds you and prevents that regression into and the falling into the abyss. That you've got strong community and strong values, a strong sense of values, not just written in paper or on the websites of organizations, but strong sense of values that are imparted on people to actually live the values. That provides the possibility of holding, so that people don't fall into the abyss. They are held by these strong sense of values, institutional values, and a culture that practices them, that promotes and encourages them.
And exactly on that point, I'm just reminded, thinking about the role of dignity. You speak about forgiveness, but forgiveness can only come when there's at least a setting that is set with actors in it, where there can be trust, and where you can start seeing that there is really something to work towards. And I think in the business world, often we try and move so fast that it is, we're trying to chase particular targets, we're chasing financial outcomes, and yet we're forgetting about the humanity and the dignity of the humans in the system that we're working with and that we are part of, the system that we're creating as part of that. I want to invite you to consider, those of you in the audience, if you'd like to ask Prof. Pumla a question. Also, those online, there might be some questions that you can type in the chat. And so I'm going to ask another question. We'll speak a little bit longer. And then please, if there's anything that you would like to ask or bring into the discussion, you're most welcome to. Prof. Pumla, so in a sense, if we think about the overwhelming nature of this, what is it that people really can take with them to say, this is what I can do next? Because where there's no hope, there's no future. So what is it that every individual, whether you're a leader of a business organization or whether you don't regard yourself as a leader, what is it that we can do to start untangling this mess? It seems to me most likely the untangling will happen in a way, it kind of spreads, it spreads faster when something is positive. There's a spillover that happens that often changes the system much faster than what we anticipate. But in a sense, I'm hearing you saying we've got to go slow before we can go fast.
You know, I'm sorry to say, I say I'm sorry because there's been questions about whether actually the slow is effective. You know, some people want to think in large scale, you know, do this at a big scale. But I really think that we have to do that. We have to, because, you know, these problems are both personal and social, you know. And in order to get to the personal, you need to come close. You know, it's very easy to leave people behind when you are not coming close. Because whatever you say, I mean, even this conversation evokes so much. I mean, I've listened, for instance, to, when I drive back home, I listen to the Cape Talk, John Needham, and he often he makes people angry because he reminds South Africans about the sense of responsibility towards one another as people coming from different racial groups. And invariably, there will be someone who's angry who calls, you say, forget the past, you know, why are you always, you know, rehashing the past? Why don't you move forward? And other worse things. And so that is what happens when, so the question is, why are these people responding in that way? I remember when at the start of transformation in business, when it was, you know, there were targets, it was the in thing, there would be transformation officers, you know, all these companies, Deloitte and whatever, they all were hiring transformation officers. And they were inviting people to work with their organization. And so I remember that one of the challenges that was put to me was how many times are you going to meet with small groups? The only thing we should just meet as a whole company and have a workshop with the whole company. Well, there are people who are doing that. But what is most important, I mean, this is, for instance, why I think this is important is that when you are in a smaller group, it is easy for you as a person who's facilitating to make contact with this person so that by making contact with the person, it becomes possible for them to reflect. I mean, this idea of reflecting on our actions is so important because often we react because you are afraid of facing a shame, or you are afraid of admitting the truth to how you are connected to the past. It makes you ashamed, and because you can't face the shame, you project it onto the other person. So you are projecting the hate that actually belongs to you. And often, you know, the dynamics of violence and anger and identity politics that are violent, often that is the source. And when there is a group that is more controlled, it becomes possible, you know, to go deeper with these kinds of conversations. Already, one of my colleagues, William Verwoerd, is running these kinds of, you know, workshops, stroke experiential encounters across the university. He's working with the transformation office, and his word is deepening, you know, is that you are really deepening the encounter. Why is that important? Because that is how solidarity emerges, solidarity with the other, understanding the other, and building a sense of solidarity with the other. It does not put food on the table, but it does inspire a consciousness about social justice. That's what solidarity does, because then you can hold hands because you've built this sense of solidarity. And it's not impossible to do that in a larger scale, but the possibility of deepening that encounter is very mild when it comes to engaging with a larger group. This way of doing things, it's possible for people to establish relationships. I mean, one of the things that struck me the most when I was working with these companies in the early 1990s was to learn that even though people were working together, they've never been to each one another's homes. You know, you went around the table and you find that, you know, the white manager has never had a black person in their home. And then you try to find out why. There's a fear, there's an unsaid fear of whatever, you know, it is. There's so many things that people are afraid of. One example that you may laugh at it, but it's real. The man says, I've got dogs in my house and I don't want to be the white man who is known in my company to have the dogs that bark at black people. So, I mean, it sounds so, you know, so flimsy, that kind of idea. And then there are black people who are afraid of inviting white people because what are you going to say when you sit with them around the table? So there are all these fears that prevent us from engaging with one another that I wouldn't be surprised, even today, there are people, even at our university, who may never have had a person of a different racial group in their home. How can that be when we are in an environment that is constantly talking about getting to know one another and transforming? How do you transform when you are living, you're living with your own group and you're constantly going back home, never learning about what is happening in the lives of the other person? How can you even imagine the possibility of transformation?
So deep relationship building.
It's really very important. It's unfortunately, you know, I think we've got to also accept that within these groups, these deep relationship forming, we perhaps are not doing enough to ensure that there is, you are passing on, you know, this kind of relation possibilities to the next generation. I don't think we're doing that enough. I was at one university some years ago that was doing amazing work, and for 3-4 years, things were really going splendidly well because there was leadership. There was clear, decisive, you know, work that was taking place, and people were coming on board, supporting the vice chancellor at this university. But at the beginning of the 4th year, you started to see what the turning again away from this movement. And it's not difficult to see why, because, you know, the group, the cohort that you were working with was walking along with you. But we come from a country that is divided. So every 4 years, there's going to be a new cohort of people who have not had this experience. So you can't just do it as a tick box. You've done it, and then it's going to have its own life. Unfortunately, the work calls us to constantly be at work, you know, and this is why some people don't like this work, because it's too much, it's too exhausting. They get tired because they've got to open themselves up. They don't want to do, it's too exhausting. And I'm sure you've encountered those kinds of people too, who you walk along with them, you think you're together, you're walking along, you're working with this, and then comes a point where you are confronting the person at a personal level, and they start throwing up, you know, the toys out of the court because now you're confronting them. It's okay when they're the ones who are defining the agenda, but when it comes to them, they've not done that work. And that's where, you know, things fall apart. Yes. Because there is no real commitment. You start with the self, and then because then you understand what it takes. But often people skirt around themselves. They are okay. I mean, it's almost like the example of white liberals at one of the universities where I was, who were experts on, race research. And they were very highly respected because they were leading in this research. But when it comes to the encounter in the corridors with the challenges in the relationships, it was like you can't touch them because how can you? Because I'm known, I've written about racism and, and so on and so forth. But the problem is there hasn't been the work that has to happen, that has to take place.
Yeah.
And this is why some of these projects actually fall flat, because there are these experts who are, superstars. But really, at the end of the day, it's about being a superstar rather than really actually engaging in what does it mean to change and to bring about change.
Yeah, and most probably objectifying the topic, right?
Yes.
And so for that gain. So on that point, I want to turn to the audience and ask if there's any questions to Prof. Pumla. And also bring in what I'd like to bring in is multi-generational trauma in a country like South Africa. It is clear, and we can absolutely acknowledge the racial trauma. If we think also about the other groupings in South Africa, for instance, I think about the Afrikaner history and the trauma that also went with that. What is there that we can learn or kind of pick up from that patterning and understand more about these multitudes of groupings with some form of inflicted trauma, and then what happens at the end of the day, how that gets, as you've said, you go into that cycle and you reperpetrate. If you think about a policy like apartheid, just now thinking about it, you think, how can that ever be approved? But then thinking about the history of the grouping that perpetrated, let me rather say the grouping that was the leader in perpetrating, but certainly had a system of other support.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important example in our country in thinking about, in fact, even about who are these people who were leading, apartheid. I understand that, for example, P.W. Botha was a child in the camps, in the concentration camps during the Anglo-Boer War. And so the idea that you want to protect your group, and in that self-protection, it's my group and no other. It's a self-protection. It's almost like an overwhelming sense of, I want to be, a feeling of wanting to be at the top, because you're so much at the bottom that you want to be at the top at all costs. And so the oppression of, the cycle of victims becoming perpetrators is something that has been researched in the field. And I don't think it is an exaggeration to consider that, in this case. But there's also the British, who came also to colonize, and the whole sort of superiority, British imperialism in not just in Africa, in other parts of the world as well. And so the sense of superiority, that everything else is inferior. So you get all of these kinds of tendencies that repeat themselves. And because the superiority is on the back of enslaving and oppressing others, that is denied. That history is denied, is set aside. In fact, when you think about the Truth Commission, already at the start of the Truth Commission, there was a reluctance to face that reality, that the violence that we were emerging from, the violence of apartheid, was the violence of racism, that racism and the culture of racism was actually responsible for the violence. But what happened during the TRC? It was the Eugene de Koks and all these individuals and the total denial of the relationship between the lives of white South Africans and the violence. It was denied right then at the TRC, at the start of the TRC. So when in fact, even in the process of making an apology, a person like F.W. de Klerk apologizing at the TRC, there's a moment of unsaying the apology, because now you are pushed to actually say, what is it that you apologize? Can you name the deeds? But because you are naming the deeds, you are coming too close to the bone. And so that culture of denial was cultivated right there, the separation between the life of whiteness and apartheid violence. You know, there was a separation, there's a denial. And so we see that repeating, you know, the denial is repeating even in this generation. So there's a different sense of transgenerational repetition among this group, because what is repeated there is the denial. And so it's not seen, you know, that sense of accountability is effaced completely. And because it's not confronted, it becomes, you know, the repetition of this past and the definition of what it means to be a person who is superior is repeated in the actions that some of the young people repeat in relation to their peers. And so this issue of denial is a very important, confronting it and engaging with it as a subject of inquiry, I think is very important. The Germans did it. You know, there was this so-called historians debate in Germany where historians were denying the facticity of the Holocaust. And there was a whole research and study of that. Why is the denial? We have not engaged with these kinds of investigations in our country, in our institutions. There is no, I have not seen the appetite for researching these questions. And I think it's important in terms of just new knowledge production that will help us on this journey of transformation, because we need to understand why are the starts and stops, you know. And I think if we open up the field so that there is a much deeper engagement with these questions, so that it's not simply a question of dismissing the value of the Truth Commission and therefore not wanting anything to do with that language. Because I think by doing that, we miss an opportunity to really understand what went wrong and learning what it is that we, or at least having a deeper sense of understanding and learning what it is that we missed at the time, you know, of the TRC. Going back, in other words, returning to the archive and looking at it, you know, really with open eyes, that it was a moment, as I said, doing a new thing, behold, I do a new thing. It was that kind of a moment. But what is it that we missed, you know, at that moment, and since that moment, that has gotten us to the place where we are now?
So it seems to me, and perhaps I can ask Janine, are there questions perhaps? But there's something I want to say about solidarity, but please.
It's not online.
Not online? Anybody in the room? So if I can, Prof. Pumla, if I can take this together and, you know, just reflect, because there's so many different strands. The one, though, that keeps repeating itself is this idea of trauma that is not dealt with re-traumatizes, and re-traumatizes in terms of the individual's ability, whether they can or cannot deal with it, it may turn into violence. Violence can be multiple acts, as you've just indicated. It can be what we physically see as and know as violence, but it can also be governance, transgressions, and so on, and poor governance, right? So it can manifest in many ways. It's acts of aggression. To summarize, and coming back to our theme tonight, about the healing of a nation, and about thinking where we're at and why we're there, which we touched on, many of the reasons why that can be. How do we create a sense of solidarity so that we can move forward? How can we give hope to say that moment of the TRC can be another moment? Then we can create these moments. They don't exist out there, and if you've missed the moment, you've missed it. It is something we can create.
You know, there was a moment, another moment of hope when we finally managed to get Jacob Zuma to resign. That night of that 14th of February was a real moment of hope. And then there was Cyril Ramaphosa's speech, which is probably the last inspiring speech that he has ever made. The last. That was a true moment of hope. I mean, didn't we really just, because we had just had these destructive, exhausting, impossible years that you woke up, you had to think, am I in Russia or am I in South Africa? You know, there are moments that you really didn't believe that you are in South Africa, the kinds of things that were happening, the news. So when you finally, I mean, so many of us were glued in front of our TVs or our computers, waiting for this man to just give up and leave. And when we did, we breathed a sigh. That was a moment of hope. And it was like so short-lived that you wonder, how do we restore that hope, really? What is necessary? And so the answer to the question really is there isn't one way of doing it. There absolutely isn't one way of doing it. I mean, our problems in our country, we talk about violence. Just the other day, I mean, it so happens that I had been thinking about violence because 2 days ago, I think it was Friday, the 28th, it's Bongani Mayosi's birthday. You know, Bongani Mayosi, who died of suicide at UCT. And I was thinking a lot about, they celebrate, this was, I think it was the 3rd annual celebration lecture, celebrating Bongani Mayosi. And I was listening to this and I was thinking to myself, and they had a very good speak, all the speakers had been really excellent speakers. And I was thinking to myself, what is not happening with all of these celebrations of Bongani Mayosi? What is not happening? We're not talking about why did he die? You know, what was, you know, I was on the commission that was invited to investigate, you know, the circumstances that led to his passing, Bongani's passing. And some people will say, you know, he never cried for help. There is absolute evidence that he cried for help. He was asking people to help him. There is evidence of that. There is also evidence that there are young people who are filled with regrets for having played a role in that. But we don't want to say that because you know, you can't upset, you know, the story of this historical moment of which was important in terms of transformation and movement, students' movement. We don't want to confront that. And the more we don't want to confront it, the more it re-emerges in our institutions because it was never confronted. it was never dealt with. That violence, the question about how do we restore hope? We restore hope first of all by facing these truths, difficult as they may be, facing these truths, because if we do not, and we continue in the way of being careful, for whatever reasons we want to be careful, we have not confronted, the reality of why we are where we are now. We have not told that kind of story. We're telling the story of heroism. We're not telling the story of what were the moments when we went low and what was lost with that. Because we need to face that. And I think that in all these institutions, whether it is business, it is places of higher learning, it is schools. I mean, you hear the stories at schools, these problems are erupting even at schools. So in the final analysis, of course, we are the group of people who have their foot in the door, because all of us, we have the privilege of being, in these kinds of institutions. But when you drive back home, you drive back through the utter depravity of people crying out to be recognized as human others. But there is no sense of that recognition from our own governments. And so the whole thing about, what do they call it, ANC renewal. I mean, this talk about renewal, there's a lot of work that needs to happen. It's important to talk about that, but what does it mean when the truths are not being faced, And so there needs to be, multiple engagements. We need to have a national conversation, not in terms of on television, but really all these sectors to think creatively about how do we refine one another and begin the journey of healing our institutions. What are the changes that are necessary? You were saying earlier that there is a tendency to focus on the business model, drive and, targets and so on. It's happening even in our institutions, wouldn't you agree? I mean, this drive, it's not just in fact, the business. Your people have influenced our universities. Because now we are also, the universities are approached with that prism, of targets and pushing and leaving the human behind. But fortunately, there is an awareness that there's something wrong with that.
Yes.
So for instance, I know that within our own institution, Stellenbosch University, there's a return to this idea of, what are our values? Yeah. How do we bring people back to our values? Yeah. So there is an awareness, and so how do we strike a balance between pursuing that for the sake of, this is the structure that we've been dealt with, but at the same time, refinding, one another and creating these spaces, these zones, of empathy, zones where solidarity become, possible, caring, a sense of caring becomes possible. We already have the language for that, in our country. And so how do we reconnect with that language and now so that it becomes, enacted rather than simply knowledge that exists out there, but rather one that is implemented in our relationships. Yes. Because we ourselves are, we ourselves in relation to others. And so if the eyes with which we see others are such that they dehumanize the other or they see them as less than we are, then there is no strong relationships that are going to be built.
Yeah, definitely. Janine, is there a question?
Yes, there are a few and a couple of comments, and if you don't mind, I wanted to just summarize them. There's some comments made about acknowledging healing and work that's already been done, and the importance of acknowledging that. Someone else is mentioning the impact of trauma on the physical body and how that affects individual society and so forth. Then someone else asked about how do we deal with the divide that's created on social media? You know, we also have limited space and characters, etc., and how that drives the ability to connect on a personal level. And then another comment, and this is from me, and when we move the conversation, I want to know the importance of our humanity or collective humanity. Have we maybe lost that ability and that touch of treating any other human being or any other living being as a likeness and as an equal? And I mean, if you look at all the violence in society, not just on a racial level, but on a gender level and onto children, and you've got to, and it's not just in our country, it's across the world. And I mean, the UK has made huge headlines recently. One has to wonder whether people have lost touch with their sense of humanity, and if that is perhaps also contributing to something like the racial intolerance and lack of empathy that's being visible in so many of these incidents.
So maybe, Prof. Pumla, those are quite a few comments on them, you know, to consider. So maybe if you want to start with the issue of humanity, and then we can look at the tool of social media in perhaps helping to construct some of that humanity and whether that's even possible.
There was a question, Anita, maybe just quickly, or a comment about trauma and how the body carries the trauma. That person is absolutely right. You know, some of these experiences are so subtle, you know, the carrying of the trauma. Sometimes it's so subtle that it catches you unawares, you know, the way that people react and behave towards one another. They are carrying something, you know, there's something, a burden that they are carrying that may not even belong to them. You know, it's connected to who they are, what their identity is, what their social identity is. And so these traumas are, you know, the embodiment of trauma is something that is very real. This is why these close encounters are so important, because we come together as bodies, you know, that are historicized bodies. We carry history. And so when we encounter one another, we are bringing that history that we carry into the space of conversation. And the challenge is how do we become open with one another so that it touches even the core that we want to hide from each other, right? The issue of loss of humanity, it's a very big concern of where we are. And when we think about, now you mentioned, you know, the connection to some cultural ways of being, you know, cultural practices and cultural ways of being. And it's no exaggeration to say that that has been lost, you know, that has been broken. And why? Because families, as we understand them, you know, as we understand them, within which that structure of that practice was cultivated or was made possible, no longer exists in that way. And so there's a certain, you know, acknowledgement that is necessary in terms of how that was broken, how that possibility was broken. Now, I like to speak about the languaging of that humanity, of that connection with humanity in my own language, because really, when in Xhosa you say umuntu, ubuntu, it's a different kind of humanness. You know, it's so almost like it's given that whoever you are, you are like me. You are ungumdu, you know. When we say in my language, ungumdu or aungumdu, you know, you're doing something that is not worthy of your being part of this community of abantu, you know. And it's a way of understanding what being a person to another means, instead of being human, because being human means we are professionals, we are professors, we are educated. That's the definition of humanity in the Western sense of understanding the word. In its original meaning, ukuba ngumuntu, you know, means it's a given you're a person. In fact, the word umntu means you're a person, not human. That's a different level of understanding. In this language, you are a person, which means that it's a given that you relate to me, we relate to each other as abantu, phakathi kwabantu, people, persons among persons. That's, you know, that word goes deep. It's not just a word. It's also in terms of, there are certain things that I can't do because you're a person, you know. That's what the understanding is. But all of that, you know, that has been lost because the meaning, the depth of what that means has been lost. And so how do we restore it now? There's different languages now to try to restore. The establishments like businesses, institutions, they've got mission statements and values, you know, and that is important. The question is, how do you live those values? And those values are in order to recognize and acknowledge the dignity of the other person, you know, because when you look at an other as an other outside of who you are, then you are not honoring them. But ukuba ngumuntu, you're setting yourself aside. You are going, this other, the existence of this other person exists beyond yourself, so that, you know, it's not just about me, you know, this kind of human relationships. It's really about the definition of my personhood depends on my bestowing personhood upon you. And that's what my personhood means. Because if I don't do that, then who am I in this relationship if I cannot impart, bestow that personhood on another? So these values are meant to restore, to honor others with dignity. But often, as you know, it remains in statutes, you know, or on websites of business departments. There isn't a commitment to really think about or think through, what do these values mean? What do we do in order to restore the sense of dignity and to build that sense of, you know, of solidarity? You know, how do we look, the way that people run their, you know, departments or whatever is so contrary to some of these values that are really wonderful values. And you hear people complaining about how they are bullied in their departments, or how they are undermined, how they are not treated, you know, with respect. And sometimes it goes both ways. You find a person in a position of leadership treating, you know, others with respect, and you find people taking that for granted. That too is possible, that people don't, you don't get this kind of reciprocal, you know, mutual relationships of trust and dignity making, you know, together. So there is a need to really have a much more concerted effort to embrace, finding ways of embracing and living these values. And so what it takes is really processes, and you are taught to be what you are. You are taught, you watch. I mean, someone asked me once, about my father, and what my relationship with my father was. And in the end, the person said, I can see that you're close to your father because I know your father so well. So much of the mannerisms and the way you relate to people is so much like your father. And so it's true that, the example, learning by example, so that in these institutions where we are, even the idea of what you do to people, how you treat people who are in the streets, as a person in your family, how do you treat the people in the street? What do you do? How do you treat people who are in need? What do you do? How do you treat people in your workspace? What is it that you are modeling? And so that, it seems to me, is something that that's how you teach what it means to be human, by example. But then you may ask the question, what about leaders who don't know how to do that? Well, the teaching has to go even to a higher level than to engage with those who are at the level of management, so that there is an understanding of what is the culture that we're trying to cultivate in this institution. What are we trying to, how do you want people to come out different at the end of the 3 years that they've been here? What are they studying? Are they just studying their subject matter, or are they studying ethical morality? Or are you infusing your teaching with courses or subjects that are teaching the people just civility? What does it mean? What does, public civility mean? How do you teach them? There are different ways of thinking about this. And as you know, our university has been in conversation about how best to do this.
Yes, most certainly. And I think definitely at the business school, we really are trying to put in a lot of effort about the notion of responsible leadership, what that means, how you embody it, to think about it, this discussion we're having tonight. And so I want to end off, bring it together. And Jerry will be doing the words of thank, but I'd like to thank you, Prof. Pumla, for bringing that sense of humanity, also with very powerful examples, things that we are reminded of, the notion of memory and how memory can help us in this. The idea that a failed state doesn't happen just all by itself, and that there's a level of complicity in it for us as the community living in South Africa, and what it is that we do on a daily basis to ignore that, to deny that, but also the sense of hope for us to actually find our sense of hope by forming relationships. And that is actually relatively easy. It's not very difficult. And so I really want to, I want to thank you. I agree. There can be many complexities in it, and vulnerability is needed, right?
Yeah.
But the hope, the starting in the relational and the dignity. So thank you very much for this contribution that you've made. And I hand over to Njeri.
Getting the mic for our online audiences. I was told I have to stand in the screen. Let me start with saying thank you to Anita for holding the conversation and asking the guiding questions and opening the space for our reflection on this really important topic of national healing, trauma, but also hope. So thank you, Anita, for curating this space and for kicking off our year on such a meaningful note. And then to Pumla, thank you so much for your clear, candid, as always, responses, for sharing your insights, but also your stories, your human stories that are so helpful for us to ground the sometimes complex concepts that you're sharing with us. So thank you for sharing your human experience, your stories, as well as your wisdom and your insights. And then to the business school marketing team, to the caterers and all the behind the scenes staff, thank you for making this event a success. And to yourselves, the audiences, thank you for joining us. This is a space for us to reflect on these conversations. This is just the start of the Leaders Angle for the academic year, and we welcome you to follow the communication channels to see what other interesting topics we'll be delving into. And with that, let me allow Janine to share some gifts.
Just a tiny little gift to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Tiny, it's heavy.
Thank
Says
you.
it's tiny. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
And I think that brings it to an official close. Thank you. Thank you, everyone online as well.
Thank you.